All right, so I want to say hi to a couple from our Young Pros ministry that said he can't be here, but we're going to be watching online. So, hi, Sydney and Alex. I hope this is working. It was fun. We had some technical difficulties in the first service. Oh, I'll plug it in next time. So over the past 6 weeks or so, we've covered a lot of ground. When I was last up here, we were talking about the history of what we called and what Christians have called the culture wars. And this is what you've heard it referred to in politics, where the church and culture slowly grew apart. We have talked about some new exciting ways that our church and that we as Christians have to share some videos of songs we like, stuff that we post on our church's Facebook page or on our church's Twitter account. And we have a huge platform to share our faith over social media. And then we've talked about some of the ways that Christians and the secular world view some of the issues of our faith. We talked about the perception that Christians, don't step there, that Christians hate science. And we talked about the way that the secular world views the Bible, or how they think we view the Bible, that it's this book of fairy tales made up thousands of years ago that for some reason we've decided are our favorite fairy tales. And we've tried to debunk those myths. So now that we have talked about these things, what's next? Where do we go from here? What do we do? Well, this is where it's time for us to fix the rift that we started. You may remember I said that in the 80s and 90s, Christianity pulled away from culture, and we said, culture is our enemy. We're pulling away. We're starting to make our own movies. We're going to make our own music. We're going to read our own books, and we're going to do our own thing now. You guys can do whatever you want. We don't like you anymore. And then we saw that especially after 9/11, early in the 2000s, culture decided, well, if that's the way you're going to treat us, we're going to treat you the same way. We don't want anything to do with you. Now it is time to bridge that gap. And it's not going to happen because they're going to start flooding our doors. Oftentimes, the person that pulls away, and you may feel this in your relationships, in your friendships, in your marriages, the person that pulls away is the one that has to make the first step towards reconciliation. Because the person that they pulled away from doesn't trust them anymore. And this is the story of countless people. I used to go to a church, but I asked questions that they didn't want me to ask. And so I did away with Christianity. I used to go to a church, but they cared more about the music I listened to than me as a person. So I stepped away. But this is still scary, isn't it? It's scary because they don't believe the things we do, and they seem really confident, guys. If we were looking just at their confidence and the energy that they invest in conversations, it's easy to say, well, they really look like they're right. But we also still view the world negatively. And there's a scriptural reason for this. Oftentimes we translate the world to mean just negative influences. I look back and I kind of laugh now. I was not allowed to watch Boy Meets World growing up, because it was Boy Meets World and therefore had to be worldly, when in fact it was really one of the most family-friendly shows on television at the time. But just because it contained world in the title We assumed it must be bad. But we need to know the world. We need to go out into it. If we look at the models of the biblical missionaries, they don't just sit there in Jerusalem and say, well, I hope they come here. No, they go out. Paul describes how he does this in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul's great at this, by the way, because Paul is a Jewish man with a Jewish education. He also has a Greek education, and he was a Roman citizen, which meant he could get away with a lot and go places other people couldn't. There's actually a great story. This is an aside. There's a great story where Paul is in trouble, and he's about to be flogged, and he turns to the person about to flog him and says, are you going to whip a Roman citizen without a trial? And the person with the whip goes, ah! Because that would get him in trouble. This is how Paul says to interact with the world, or his method. Though I am free, I belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many people as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. To those that are not under the law, I became like one not under the law, although I am under God's law through Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that some of them might be saved. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessing. So I love Paul's approach. I become like them, I don't become them. I become like those under the law, I don't necessarily follow the law. I become like those that are not under the law. That doesn't mean I'm free to do whatever I want to do. But I understand who they are. I understand their motivations. I understand their values. We see how Paul's ideas work when he preaches in Athens in Acts 17, 16 through 34. While Paul was waiting in Athens, his spirit was troubled within him when he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with those who worshipped God, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Then also some of the philosophers argued with him. Some said, "What is this pseudo-intellectual trying to say?" We may think that people started thinking Christians were silly or stupid recently. Paul encountered it too, which is a great encouragement to me. There is nothing new that Christianity hasn't already answered. Others replied, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign deities because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection." They took him and brought him to the Areopagus and said, "May we learn about this new teaching you're speaking of?" So the Areopagus, which may have looked like this, it's the city center. It's the forum in Athens. Athens is the cultural seat of Greece. And so they take Paul to the Areopagus, to the forum, because this is where you talk about new ideas. This is where you go specifically to talk about new ideas. We don't have a great analog to the Areopagus. We don't have a place where people go specifically to go meet new ideas they may disagree with, and talk them over. When we meet to talk about new ideas, we tend to be like boxers coming out of our corners. Ding, ding, we're ready to go. Duke's up. We're about to duke it out. So it's a different environment that I don't think we've completely lost, but that we need to work on regaining. So maybe take him to the Areopagus. For what you say sounds strange to us, and we want to know what these ideas mean. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners residing there spent their time on nothing else but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every respect. For as I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I even found an altar on which was described, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in shrines made by hands. Neither is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath to all things. From one man he has made every nation of men to live all over the earth, and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live, so that they might seek God, and perhaps they might reach out and find him, though he is not far from each of one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Being God's offspring, then, we shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image fashioned by human art and imagination. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day on which he is going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed. He has provided proof to this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some began to ridicule him, but others said, "We want to hear about this again." So Paul went out from their presence. However, some men joined him and believed. I read all that without commentary from me because I wanted you to see the entire pattern of what Paul does there. He starts off with the idols in that sermon. I can see you are very religious. I can see you're very devoted to your God. In fact, you're so devoted to your God, you worship gods you may not know about yet. I want to tell you about that God. He understands their devotion to the idols. He knows the poetry, as he mentions it later on. He gets and actually praises their devotion and their worship. He uses that as a launching point, and in 3 paragraphs tells them the gospel story from, you guys do a really good job worshiping idols. Paul never believed in the idols. He is able to use the idols as a starting point to share his belief in Christ. And he was made fun of for it. And he left a stone in other people's shoes, and they said, "This is interesting. I want to hear more." And then others were convinced and began to follow him. How do we do this? Well, how do we navigate these scary conversations? Well, for one thing, I'll say we actually have a command to. 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. The operative verse in that is, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that is within you. Could you do that? Would you be prepared to explain to someone why you're hopeful, why you believe in Christ, why you believe there's going to be a resurrection, why you think there is a heaven at the end of this? Those are scary interactions. But there are a number of people developing materials to help you navigate that. I want to point out one. I want to point out Greg Kokel and his organization, Stand to Reason. Their website is str.org, and we had some people in first service checking it out, and they were like, this is great stuff. So he is a Christian philosopher and apologist. He's someone that works in his field is the stuff that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. And he has developed his model for what a Christian ambassador should be. That's his metaphor. We are not going out looking to start fights. We're ambassadors of Christ. He says a Christian ambassador needs 3 things. They need knowledge, they need wisdom, and they need character. You need knowledge because you need to know what you believe and why you believe it. You need wisdom because you need the ability to discern when you have an opportunity and the ability to argue your case logically and present a logical case. And you need character. You need character so you don't undermine your knowledge and your wisdom. You need to live a life that does not hurt your witness. You need to be consistently being the person they know you to be with integrity. You cannot have the skeletons in your closet. Or if you do, at the very least, you need to be open with those struggles. Because we all struggle with parts of this story, and we don't like to talk about it. Once you have these three things, you'll be amazed. You won't have to go and seek people out. Your friends that know you're a Christian and that aren't will begin talking to you. I've experienced that 60% that want to talk about spiritual things. And it's amazing how I'd be driving a friend somewhere and they'd say, hey, I know you're a Christian. What do you think this part of the Bible's about? What do you think about that? Because they're curious. Now you may be saying, that sounds amazing. And the other half of you says, that sounds terrifying. Because I don't know how to answer those parts. Well, Greg has another thing I want to recommend, and I'm going to give this, what I think is the best part of this to you in brief. This is from his book, Tactics, which he describes as a guideline to discussing your Christian convictions. Tactics, we start with the Columbo tactic. Now, a lot of you may be too young. I'm too young to really remember Columbo, the detective and television show. But Columbo, he always looked kind of disheveled. He didn't look like he had everything together. He'd kind of walk in to interview someone like this, like he's mulling it over. He can't figure it out. He presented himself as this dum-dum. He'd have his pad out and review the questions because he couldn't remember them. And he'd just keep asking questions. And then he'd use his questions to kind of corner them. Because he didn't look like he had everything together, they would begin to feel comfortable around him. And that is how he would catch them. By continuing to ask questions, he'd catch them in a lie. Now, our goal is not necessarily to catch people in a lie with this, but these three questions will at least get them thinking, which is a much more achievable goal. Remember, even Paul, it said some people outright rejected it. Some people said, I want to hear more about this. Hopefully this gets you to the I want to hear more about this. But there are three questions. The first is, what do you mean by that? So someone says, I don't really see how anyone can believe in God. Two questions should come to mind. What do you mean by God? What do you mean by believe? Let's talk about what Christians mean by faith, because it's not quite what you meant by believe. It's funny. I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in too. We often talk right past each other because we're too busy arguing that we never understand what the other person believes. The second question, how'd you come to that conclusion? Okay, so you don't believe in God. And we talked about what God means and what belief means. So what was it that led to your belief in God? Or to your disbelief in God? Share your story with me. Explain it to me. And then the final question, hey, have you considered that if belief is not just blind faith, but actually belief based on evidence, maybe there's some good evidence for God out there? Have you looked into that? Have you considered that may be the case? And now they have something to think about when that conversation's over. Now, you haven't been aggressive. You've just tried to understand. You just tried to help them see it from your perspective with that last question. There are many objections and many reasons people reject the Christian faith. Most of the reasons people believe or disbelieve in something is not based on rationality. It's based on emotions. It became not easy to believe in that, so I guess I have to disbelieve it now. I didn't feel like believing, so I guess disbelief was more emotionally satisfying, so I went there. These ask them to think about it. The goal first is to understand, and second, to inspire them to think. So here's a question, though. This is the big one. You may be excited to go out to ask your friends these questions. That's awesome. I am excited to hear the stories of you doing that. Can you answer these questions? Someone came up to you and said, so you believe in God, right? Yeah, I do. What do you mean by God? Would you be ready to give an answer? Why do you believe in God? We need to have a strong base before we're ready to go out. We don't need to be perfect. We will never have absolute knowledge of God, but we need to be able to at least answer these questions ourselves before we go out and begin asking them of people. But there's more than one way to influence culture. Greg Koukl and tactics are fantastic. And this is just one method, one way of doing it. But there are other ways to influence culture than person by person. One way is through art. Atheist turned Christian Holly Ordway said her first experiences with Christianity were through the works of Lewis and Tolkien. And in fact, I'll just get into this. She said, this was on a recent podcast. The podcast is Unbelievable, and where they usually put a Christian in conversation with someone that's not a Christian. And these get really heady, but it's an excellent show for understanding both views. She described her past saying, I grew up in a family that didn't discuss faith. And I thought that if it wasn't worth discussing, then it must not be important enough to talk about. And if it's not important, it doesn't matter if I don't believe in it. The host said, now, what were some of your first experiences? And she said, there were a couple of things that led me to faith. One was reading imaginative literature. I read the Narnia Chronicles of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. There was something about those works that really gave me a meaningful vision of the world that was really beautiful and really meaningful. As I looked back on it further, I realized that it was the way they saw joy and beauty but didn't sugarcoat the world. Both Tolkien and Lewis were very upfront about the existence of pain and suffering and questions. This was integrated world. This integrated world was very attractive, where there's pain and joy, and we live in the mix between those. Where there's faith and questions, and we live in the mix between those. The host then asked her, did you know you were reading Christian works at the time? And she said, I had not the faintest idea. And I was actually very angry with C.S. Lewis for a while after I learned. And I was like, how did I not know this was about Jesus? How can this be Jesus? She had accepted Jesus and the Christian worldview as something beautiful that was appealing to her before she even knew what it was. So that by the time she was ready to have those logical conversations, she already knew she was going somewhere beautiful. And that made her faith easier to develop and latch onto. Because these worlds were created and well-developed, emotionally real and morally difficult, she saw the attractiveness of Christianity before she ever realized that's what she was saying. It was beautiful. In fact, early in the history of Israel as a nation, in Exodus, we get this riveting part of Scripture. Make the ephod of gold, and of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and of finely twisted linen, the work of skilled hands. It is to have 2 shoulder pieces attached to 2 of its corners so it can be fastened. Its skillfully woven waistband is to be like it. 1 piece with the ephod, and made of gold, and with blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and with finely twisted linen. Take 2 onyx stones and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel in the order of their birth. 6 names on one stone and the remaining 6 on the other. Engrave the names of the sons of Israel on the 2 stones, the way a gem cutter engraves a seal. Then mount the stones in gold filigree on the settings, and fasten them on the shoulder pieces of the ephod as memorial stones for the sons of Israel. Aaron is to bear the name on his shoulders as a memorial before the Lord. Make gold filigree settings and 2 braided chains of pure gold like a rope, and attach the chains to the settings. That was cut from VBS. no one, like we all memorized after John 3:16, the instructions for making the priestly ephod. This is the part of Exodus that we're like, all right, I said I was going to read through the Bible in a year, which means I have to read this part too, I guess. But you don't see how it's directly related to your spiritual walk, so it's not the most fun. But what do we learn here? God cares about art and design. Look at what this is supposed to do. This reminds Israel of where they came from. When the priest wears this, he prepares himself mentally, remembering years of tradition as he's about to go interact with God. It's a sign that signals what's about to happen. And so I wonder about the current state of Christian art. Would we even say that we had Christian art going on right now? I think I have a C.S. Lewis quote up there next. Is that the next slide? Okay, here we go. C.S. Lewis is an author that wrote Christian books. He's also a literature professor. In college, in medieval literature, I read the literary criticism of C.S. Lewis. It's really good, but I'm not going to quote it because you'd all think it was really boring. Some of you may think that we're already really boring. Well, can't help you with that. If the ephod chapter doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will. What he said is, what we want is not more little books about Christianity. What we want are more little books by Christians on other subjects, with the Christianity latent. To paraphrase this, we don't need more books written by Christians for Christians. We need more Christians writing good books based on a Christian worldview for everyone. I'm afraid that most of Christian art has become commodified. It's become something that they can market and appeal to Christians that is sold, that will never reach the larger culture, and in fact is ridiculed by the larger culture. I'm afraid that much of mainstream Christian art has stopped glorifying God and is instead designed to line the pockets of man. It has become a genre, something that appeals to some people and not to others, rather than a powerful way of revealing truth. Much of Christian music and media is not the well-developed worlds of Tolkien and Lewis that began to lead Holly Ordway to faith. They are Pollyanna stories, where we are taught that faith is simple. God will answer all your prayers. Christianity will make your life easier. It always works out for the believers, and non-believers are always punished. It reflects the reality the way marketers believe that Christians want it to be, not the way God created it to be. Because it doesn't reflect reality the way God created it to be, it doesn't honor God. Because it doesn't honor God, it's bad art. It's disingenuous art. And because it creates an insulated culture, more worried about its own safety and its own sensibilities, it's bad for Christians and for the public perception of Christianity. That's not all Christian art. The band did a great job this morning playing songs designed by Christians, for Christians, to lead them deeper into worship. And we've always had that side of art. That's not the type of art that I'm talking about. But how do we change this? And you probably, in your mind, have an idea of the type of art that I'm talking about. You may feel powerless because you don't have artistic talent. And that's okay. Because all of us have the power to influence what gets made. Because we have the power to watch what we want to watch, to buy what we want to buy, to stream what we want to stream. I would encourage us to expand the way we think about that. Not caring just about content that we find objectionable, but also thinking deeply about the way this media reflects Christianity. Two of the best written Christian characters I can think of right now come from secular media. It's the priest in the Daredevil series, who was always there for Matt Murdock, knows he's doing something awful, and in many ways is trying to save Matt Murdock, the Daredevil's soul, from the anger that resides in it that leads him to do a lot of the things he does. And it's in books. Okay, though, I'm a nerd. This is accepted. The Dresden Files are a great series of realistic, it's called urban fantasy, where it's set in Chicago, but Chicago is this epicenter for all sorts of wizards and werewolves and all sorts of neat things. These are bestsellers. And some of the best characters are the Carpenter family, who are deeply religious and imperfect. They're doing their best, but they're always there as a base for people. To the extent that I'm not sure the author may be a Christian and I just don't even know it. Because I'm not quite an expert on this stuff, I went and I asked some of my friends that are artists. And I asked them 3 questions. The first question: is there a difference between Christian art and a Christian artist? Between the genre Christian art and Christians that are making art? This stuff was really interesting. Fascinating responses that I got. The first one is from Dr. Marcia Herlow, a poet and my poetry professor. It was great to reconnect with her some. She said, "Christian art to me is the result of the artist trying to use the art form to convey a Christian message or create a piece of art for use in worship. The message or purpose is first, rather than the artistic impulse." So we try and create something that has meaning, and so it may not necessarily be a good reflection. We start with meaning and a thesis statement in the art rather than just an expression of what it is. She says, Christian art, in the ideal sense, is art that the Christian creates using the normal creative process. Plus, it points the observer to a greater understanding of God and our relationship with Christ. So there's part of this that starts with meaning, and I want to convey this message, so I'm going to make a movie to convey this message. And it becomes not that great of a movie. Versus, you know what? I'm going to express my own struggle with this right now in a way that's glorifying to God. The second response comes from Sidney King, who usually sits like right around there. You know which one is Sidney because you know who's more likely to have made that artwork. You have other gifts. She said, I know my ability to create was given to me by God and my parents. I see myself as a Christian who makes art, but my work may not be considered Christian art because of the images I use. She doesn't, you can see this image. Can you see it very well? It's a wonderful image. It looks like a human with almost butterfly wings, but it's like a leaf in the fall. If you've ever seen a leaf where all the chlorophyll has fallen away and is left with just the veins in the wings. So to answer your question of whether or not I think there's a difference, yes. Because it's a branch of art as a whole, like music or books, and no, because Christian art is still art. I asked my friend Angie Lister, who is an artist currently living in LA. Angie is not the cat, just in case. That'd be great, wouldn't it? Christianity is about truth, and so is art outside of rampant commercialism. I don't know if there's actually a thing as Christian art, but it's just human art. Unless a piece of artwork can accept Jesus and be baptized, can it be Christian? Don't go to a museum and try this, okay? There are still vitally strong works that have images that are Christian in many churches. The stages of the cross, stained glass windows. I think what most Christians think is Christian art is the mass-produced art that is being sold at Hobby Lobby in the name of Christianity, as the very production and shipping of these items is killing the workers of China and poisoning the earth. And then my friend Jonathan Grant I'm going to call him Grant because that's the way he went in college. He travels the world mainly between the U.S. and France trying to create spaces in churches for art to be created. He said, all art is Christian art in a greater sense. Since as created beings, we are constantly creating a search. Wow, goodness. Grant, what did you write? Since as created beings, we are constantly creating in a search for the divine. Every created work is a search for God at its most simple level, though it may often appear the opposite. So art contains meaning, but it's a deeply personalized meaning. It was created from inspiration, not in order to communicate something specific. The power of art is in that. And in this next thing. I think a lot of our art appreciation courses have taught us that poems have one specific thing that they must mean, and if you don't get that meaning, you're wrong. Or that artwork has one interpretation, and if you don't get that interpretation, you're wrong. When really the power of art is that it holds a mirror to our emotions. It causes us to think and reflect. I was actually talking to one person outside of first service who said that a therapist told him to color. And so he started, and his wife saw the coloring books and said, I can tell where you were angry, because the colors are more reds and yellows and more violent colors. And it seems like you worked that out, and the colors changed. You can't do that in an argument. I asked, what do you wish Christians knew about art? Sydney responded, something I wish Christians knew about art is one of the main cores of art itself. Art is subjective. It's not definite in its imagery, and the way you view it may change over time. Again, art holds a mirror up to ourselves. Holly Ordway saw beautiful things in Tolkien and Lewis. Someone else may read them and say, this is boring, but may love music. But art has the power to get us thinking, to get us talking. And in fact, that's something of what Angie shared. I wish Christians were more open-minded about art, knew the history of it, especially within the church. And I wish they would understand that supporting Christians who are artists is vital. I can't tell you how many times I was asked to donate a painting or paint a mural for free, as if they would ask a lawyer to represent them for free or a doctor to do free surgery. The irony is that most artists are struggling to survive, and they can contribute dialogue and beauty to their congregation. But churches are too scared of what they might create. And then I asked, what in your mind is a strong example of Christian art? And this is art that I think, let's remember Angie's definition of kind of the purpose of Christian art. To spark dialogue, to lead us deeper into a relationship with Christ, to encourage reflection. Dr. Herlo said, in poetry, I've been recently moved by Mary Karr's poetry and her struggle with faith. She's a brilliant thinker and writer who grew up Catholic. She became an alcoholic and a drug addict, and in the process of her recovery, she became a Christian, bringing her full intellect, skepticism, and experience of the darker sides of the world to the table. We know that God's grace is sufficient, but to see his grace prevail in her life, even as she resists him, is pretty knockout stuff. Obviously, I wouldn't hand her work to just anyone, but God has given her a voice and art that will reach those that need this strong witness. Grant replied, I think the work of French painter Arquebus, this is an example of one of his works, it looks to me like Mary Magdalene anointing Jesus, is a strong example of current Christian art because it is made specifically to aid worship in a church setting, yet it leaves enough space for interpretation, for mystery, and for individual experience. And then finally, Sydney responded and said, the Pietà, that is, Mary holding the body of the crucified Christ. It's one of the few pieces of art I've seen that brought tears to my eyes and rocked my soul to the core. We can't do that in argument. We can't argue for the beauty of Christ the way it's represented in works of art like this. We're afraid to go out into culture for a variety of reasons. I think we don't understand what really happens and what we have the potential to do when we go out. Part of this is because we read verses like Romans 12, 1 and 2, which contains the phrase, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world." Oh, right there. "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God." You're not living for yourself anymore. You're a living sacrifice. You're taking over the work of God on earth. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve of what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. We read this and we think, okay, I got it. God good, world bad. I want to focus on that world conform. I want you to imagine a bucket. If you are having trouble imagining a bucket, I have provided an example. I want you to imagine that the bucket is you and sand is your life. If you want to, you can take that little yellow shovel. Your shovel may not be yellow, that's okay. You can take all of your life and you can put it in that bucket of culture. You can turn it upside down. You can lift the bucket. And what will your life have conformed to? The bucket. Or you can say, you know what? I'm not letting any culture get in my life. No sand is getting in my bucket. I'm not going to put any of my life in that bucket. And you flip the bucket over, and you say, all right, no more. I'm just going to let my life pile up around culture, and I'm not going to go anywhere where the culture is, and I'm going to put my sand up all around that bucket. And what's your life going to look like? A bucket. See, some of you that have kids know how this works. You understand how this works. Hey, bedtime's 8. Well, I want to go to bed. Okay. Well, you don't have to go to bed. What if I want to? You can make someone do something two ways. You can make them want to do it. You can make it look appealing. Or you can make the alternative look unappealing. You can follow and conform to the culture by doing everything the culture says you should do. Or you can conform and allow the culture to shape your life by doing the opposite of everything culture says you should do. Here's what this verse invites us to think about. This verse says, you have the wrong bucket. Romans 12, 1 and 2, Stephen Bush commentary, wrong bucket. That's all it says. It encourages us to change the pattern that we are conforming to, not to reject the world. Again, Paul's a fantastic example of this. He's going off to persecute Christians because that's what good Jews do. He has an encounter with the risen Christ. He comes back and says, my life has changed now. I have a new bucket. But look at how he still goes and interacts with the world. It's there, but it's not the chief influence on his life. Before we go out, before we share with the culture, before we have conversations with friends, before we start making great art, we have to look in ourselves and say, what is it that I'm actually sharing? What is it that I'm offering? Do I need to change things about my own life first? Do I need to grow in knowledge and wisdom or in character? There are two ways to view the world. Right now, we can look at it and say, there is nothing of Christianity out there. It is a barren wasteland. Or we can look at it and we can say, there's so much potential out there for it to be a field. That I want to go till, and that I want to plant, and that I want to harvest. The difference is what you're allowing your life to conform to. So maybe you're there. Maybe you don't need the right questions to ask. Maybe you don't need to be encouraged to go out and make and support art that is honest, that asks questions, and that leads people to faith. Maybe you need to be the one that's having conversations, preparing yourself for that work. But that's what's next. They aren't going to come through that door unless we go out and we get them. Don't hog tie and bring your neighbors to church. That's not what I mean. We aren't going to get them through that door unless we can make Christianity look reasonable, look appealing, and model that in our own lives. That's our job. Will you pray with me? Father, thank you for how you've equipped us. Don't let us listen to this series, rest on our laurels, and stay comfortable in church. Give us courage. Give us wisdom. Give us opportunities to further strengthen our knowledge, grow in wisdom, and maintain a solid character as we go out to the world proclaiming you in whatever way you've gifted us. Pray these things in your name.